A mother cried on national television and asked the world to help find her children. Everyone believed her. But the most disturbing part of this story was not what happened to the boys. It was who had been telling the story all along. The Susan Smith case. Why? In 1994, America watched a young mother beg for help. Susan Smith stood in front of cameras, crying for her two missing sons. She said a stranger had taken her car with the children still inside. The story spread quickly. Police searched. The media followed every update, and the country stood beside her because she looked like someone telling the truth. But as investigators looked closer, small details began to change. The timeline no longer made sense. The evidence did not match the story. And slowly, the question stopped being who took the children and became whether anyone had taken them at all. Because this case was never only about two missing boys. It was about a lie powerful enough to make the entire country believe it. On October 25, 1994, in the small town of Union, South Carolina, a story began that would soon capture the attention of the entire country. Susan Smith was 23 years old. She was a young mother with two small children, 3-year-old Michael Daniel Smith and 14-month-old Alexander Tyler Smith. To the outside world, she looked like someone people could easily sympathize with, young, emotional, and desperate for help. That night, Susan told police that she had been the victim of a carjacking. According to her story, she had stopped at a red light when a black man approached her car, pointed a gun at her, and forced her out of the driver's seat. He then drove away in her burgundy red Mazda Protégé, with her two sons still strapped into their car seats in the back. It was the kind of story that created immediate panic. Two missing children, a violent stranger, a mother left screaming on the side of the road. Police responded quickly. Search teams were organized. Officers began checking roads, nearby towns, and possible escape routes. The FBI joined the investigation. Local volunteers gathered to help. Churches organized prayer circles. News stations interrupted regular programming. And at the center of it all was Susan. She appeared on television in tears, asking for help from anyone who might know something. Her voice shook as she spoke about Michael and Alex. She begged the person who had taken them to bring them home. She looked directly into the cameras and spoke not just to police, but to the entire country. Please let my babies come home. It was powerful, and people believed her. Her face was suddenly everywhere, on local news, national broadcasts, newspaper front pages. Reporters described her as a grieving mother, living every parent's worst nightmare. Her interviews were replayed again and again. The image was strong, familiar, and emotionally convincing. In 1994, before social media and instant public skepticism, television created truth for many people. And Susan looked exactly like someone telling the truth. No one wanted to imagine anything else. The town of Union became the center of a national search. Every passing hour made the story feel more urgent. Every new broadcast made the public more invested. People prayed for those boys. They searched for a dangerous stranger, and they stood beside the mother who had asked for their help. At that moment, Susan Smith was not seen as a suspect. She was seen as the victim, and that belief would shape everything that followed. Susan Smith's story spread quickly because it fit something people were already prepared to believe. In the early 1990s, carjacking had become one of America's most feared crimes. News reports across the country had turned it into a symbol of random violence. An ordinary person stopped at a light, suddenly facing a gun. Their life changed in seconds. It was a fear people recognized immediately, and Susan's version of events matched that fear perfectly. But there was another reason her story moved so fast. She said the man who took her car was black. That detail shaped everything. Without evidence, without a suspect, and without witnesses confirming the attack, the description was still accepted almost instantly. Police began searching for an unknown black male. Roadblocks were set up, cars were stopped, entire neighborhoods felt the pressure of the investigation. The case became larger than a missing person search. It became a manhunt built on a single statement. Very few people questioned it. The media repeated the description exactly as it had been given. National broadcasts focused on the danger of the unknown attacker. Newspapers described a mother robbed of her children by a violent stranger. The image was powerful, and it fit existing fears that many people already carried. In Union, churches opened their doors for prayer services. Volunteers joined search efforts. Donations came in from strangers who had never met Susan but felt connected to her pain. Community members placed ribbons, candles, and handwritten messages around town. Everyone wanted the same ending. They wanted the children found alive, and they wanted the man responsible caught quickly. Susan continued appearing in interviews. She spoke softly. She cried. She repeated the same desperate request, "Bring my boys home." To many viewers, she looked exactly how grief was supposed to look, even when some investigators quietly noticed that her emotions sometimes felt strangely controlled. Those thoughts stayed behind closed doors. Publicly, no one wanted to challenge a mother begging for her children. The story had already taken shape. She was the grieving parent. He was the dangerous stranger. And the country had chosen which version of events it believed. The problem with a story people want to believe is that they stop asking whether it is true. Every hour spent searching for an imaginary suspect pulled attention further away from the real answer. And while police searched roads, forests, and nearby towns, the truth was sitting much closer, still hidden behind the face America trusted most, the mother herself. For the first few days, investigators followed Susan Smith's story exactly as she told it. They searched for the man she described. They traced roads leaving Union, South Carolina. They checked gas stations, nearby counties, and possible routes a kidnapper might have taken. Officers worked long hours. Volunteers continued searching. The FBI remained involved. But behind the scenes, something was starting to feel wrong. The problem was simple. There was almost no evidence that the carjacking had happened at all. Police returned to the location where Susan said she had been forced out of her car. They looked for signs of a struggle, tire marks, physical evidence, witnesses, anything that could support her version of events. There was almost nothing. No clear indication of a violent confrontation, no witnesses who saw a man approach the car, no reliable evidence that someone had taken the vehicle by force. That absence mattered, because real crimes usually leave something behind. Investigators also began testing the timeline. Susan's description of where she had driven, when she had stopped, and how the car had been taken did not stay consistent. Small details changed during repeated interviews. Time gaps appeared. Certain routes did not make sense. Her answers shifted depending on who asked the question. At first, the differences seemed minor, but in a case like this, minor details become everything. Detectives asked the same questions again and again, watching for patterns. Instead, they found contradictions. Her emotional responses also drew attention. Sometimes she appeared devastated, other times strangely calm. Officers trained in behavioral observation noticed moments where her reactions did not match the urgency of the situation. It was not proof, but it added to the growing discomfort. The public did not know any of this. On television, Susan was still the desperate mother waiting for a miracle. But inside the investigation room, the direction was beginning to change. Quietly, detectives started asking a different question. Not who took the children, but what if no one did? That possibility changed everything. Because if there had been no carjacking, then there had been no stranger, no armed man, no desperate roadside kidnapping. Only a story. And if the story was false, then the person who created it was sitting right in front of them. The search was no longer only for two missing boys. It was becoming an investigation into their mother. And with every new interview, every missing detail, and every silence that felt too rehearsed, the image Susan had built in front of the cameras began to crack. As detectives looked deeper into Susan Smith's life, the case stopped being only about a missing children investigation. It became a question of motive. If Susan had lied, why would she do it? The answer began to appear in the parts of her life she had tried to keep separate from the public story. Her marriage to David Smith had been unstable for a long time. Financial problems, emotional distance, and repeated separations had created constant tension between them. By 1994, the relationship was already under pressure. They were still connected, but far from secure. Susan was struggling in other ways too. She had a history of depression. Her childhood had been marked by trauma. Her father had died by suicide when she was young, a loss that shaped much of her emotional life. There were also painful allegations involving abuse within her family, wounds that remained part of her private history. None of these things explained murder, but they helped investigators understand the emotional world she was living inside. Then they found Tom Findlay. Tom was a wealthy young man from a prominent local family. He and Susan had been involved in a romantic relationship, one that meant far more to her than it did to him. To Susan, he represented escape, a different life, stability, status, and the possibility of starting over. But Tom had made his position clear. He did not want a future that included children. At some point during the investigation, detectives discovered a letter from Tom that would become one of the most important pieces of the entire case. In it, he explained that he was not ready for a serious commitment and did not want a relationship built around children. He wanted freedom, not family responsibility. For investigators, that letter changed everything. It created a possible reason. If Susan believed that Michael and Alex were standing between her and the life she wanted, then the story was no longer random. It had direction. The children were not part of a kidnapping. They were part of an obstacle. That idea was difficult for people to accept because it required imagining something almost impossible, a mother seeing her own children not as people to protect but as barriers to remove. And yet, as detectives placed the timeline next to the letter, the emotional pressure next to the lies, and the private relationship next to the public performance, the shape of the truth became harder to ignore. This was not beginning to look like panic. It was beginning to look like planning. And behind the tears on television, investigators were now facing a darker possibility: that Susan Smith had not lost her children. She had chosen to let them go. She told the world a stranger took her children, but by now, investigators were asking a different question. What if there had never been a stranger at all? For 9 days, Susan Smith held on to the same story. She repeated it to police, she repeated it to reporters, she repeated it to the country. A stranger had taken her car. Her children were still inside. She was the mother left behind. But by early November, the pressure was becoming impossible to maintain. Investigators had too many unanswered questions. The physical evidence did not support her version of events. Her timeline kept changing. The emotional cracks were becoming harder to hide. And now, detectives understood something even more dangerous. There was a possible reason for the lie. They returned to the interviews with a different strategy. Less sympathy, more silence, more direct questions. They pushed her to explain details that no longer made sense. They challenged the missing evidence. They forced her to sit inside the contradictions she had created. Eventually, the story collapsed. On November the 3rd, 1994, Susan Smith confessed. There had been no carjacking, no armed stranger, no unknown man driving away into the night. She had been alone with her children. That night, she drove to John D. Long Lake, a quiet place not far from Union. Her 2 sons, Michael and Alex, were still strapped into their car seats in the back of the burgundy Mazda. She stopped near the water, and then she let the car roll forward, into the lake. Inside, Michael was 3 years old. Alex was 14 months old. Neither child had any way to escape. As the car disappeared beneath the water, Susan stood outside and watched. She did not call for help. She did not try to save them. Instead, she left. And she built the story the country had spent 9 days believing. When police recovered the car from the lake, the reality became impossible to look away from. The image was devastating. 2 small boys still inside, exactly where she had left them. The nation reacted with shock. The grieving mother on television became the woman who had drowned her own children. News coverage changed overnight. Sympathy turned into horror. Public support turned into rage. People asked the same question again and again. How could she do it? But for investigators, the answer was now painfully clear. This had never been about a stranger. It had never been about a kidnapping. It was a decision made in silence, long before the confession. And the most frightening part was not the lie itself, but how convincingly she had made the world believe it. Once Susan Smith confessed, the legal process moved quickly, but the public reaction moved even faster. Across the country, people who had cried with her on television now watched the case with anger. The image of a mother begging for help had been replaced by something far darker. A woman who had drowned her own children and blamed an imaginary stranger. She was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. From the beginning, prosecutors considered seeking the death penalty. The case seemed to demand it. 2 young children had been killed. The act was deliberate. The lie afterward had sent police on a false search and directed suspicion toward an innocent group of people. Public outrage was enormous, and many believed only one punishment could match the crime: death. But the defense built a different argument. They did not deny what happened. Instead, they focused on Susan's mental state, her history of depression, the trauma of her childhood, her father's suicide, and the emotional instability that had shaped much of her life. They argued that this was not the act of a cold, calculating monster, but of a deeply damaged woman whose mind had collapsed under pressure. The courtroom became a battle between those 2 images: premeditated murderer, broken mother. The jury had to decide which one mattered more. During the trial, testimony about her private life became public. Her affair with Tom Findlay, the letter about not wanting children, the lies told to police, and the final confession all returned to the center of the case. Every detail deepened the national disgust, but another part of the story also remained impossible to ignore. Susan had falsely accused a black man. That lie had triggered a massive police search and reinforced racial fear inside a community already shaped by those tensions. For many people, this was not only a murder case, it was also a case about how easily racial suspicion could be weaponized and believed. In July 1995, the jury made its decision. Susan Smith was sentenced to life in prison, not death. Under South Carolina law, she would be eligible for parole after 30 years. The reaction was immediate. Many people were furious. Some believed the sentence was too lenient. Others argued that no punishment could fully answer what had happened at John D. Long Lake. The country remained divided, not about guilt, but about justice. Had the court shown mercy where none was deserved? Or had it recognized that punishment and understanding are not always the same thing? For the families, the answer changed nothing. Michael and Alex were still gone, and the woman who had once asked the world to help save them would spend the rest of her life being remembered for why they were never found alive. The Susan Smith case was never remembered only because a mother killed her children. America has seen terrible crimes before. What made this case stay alive was something else: the lie. Susan did not simply commit murder. She created a story the entire country was ready to believe. And that story revealed something uncomfortable about everyone who believed it. When she stood in front of cameras crying, people saw what they expected to see: a grieving white mother, fragile and desperate, asking for help. That image carried trust. It felt familiar. It felt safe. At the same time, the person she blamed was someone the public had never seen: an unnamed black man. No face, no evidence, no witness. And yet, for many people, that part of the story also felt believable immediately. That was not an accident. It exposed how quickly fear and racial bias could work together. Her accusation sent police into neighborhoods searching for someone who did not exist. It placed suspicion on innocent people simply because the story matched old stereotypes people were already willing to accept. The lie worked because it fit expectations. That is what made it powerful and dangerous. The case also forced people to confront another difficult idea: the public image of motherhood. There is a strong instinct to trust a mother speaking about her children, especially when she appears broken by grief. Susan understood that. Whether consciously or not, she stood inside that image and used it. She became the perfect victim, until she became the suspect. Years later, the case still appears in documentaries, interviews, and psychological studies. People continue asking not only what happened, but why it happened this way. Why this lie? Why this performance? Why did it convince so many people so quickly? Because the truth is harder than the crime itself. It asks whether people were manipulated, or whether they simply believed the version of the world they were most comfortable with. Susan Smith became one of the most infamous names in American true crime, not only because of what she did, but because of what her story reflected back at everyone else: fear, bias, sympathy, trust, and how easily all of them can be used. She asked the world to believe her, and they did. But in the end, the real mystery was never where the children were. It was how a mother could stand in front of the world and tell that story at all. Some stories are remembered because of what happened, others because of the lie people chose to believe. The Susan Smith case was both, and even now the question remains, why? Next on True Echoes. The Susan Smith case was built on a lie, a story told to the world and believed by almost everyone. But sometimes, the truth doesn't hide behind a false story. Sometimes, it hides inside the evidence itself. In 2006, a respected dentist was found murdered inside his own home in Pennsylvania. No robbery, no random intruder, just a brutal, deeply personal crime. As investigators looked closer, suspicion moved toward the people closest to him, an ex-wife, a new relationship, and a case that would soon depend on one thing: DNA. Because this time the question was not only who killed Dr. John Yelenic, it was whether the most trusted evidence in the courtroom could be wrong. Next on True Echoes, the John Yelenic case. The truth coming soon on True Echoes. Final question. She asked the world to believe her, and they did. But in the end, the real mystery was never where the children were. It was how a mother could stand in front of the world and tell that story at all. What do you think made this lie possible? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk. Every voice matters. Subscribe and step into the echoes of truth. To be continued.